$2 trillion. This was the volume that BlackRock relocated outside the United States. And this has already happened. It's not a prediction. It's not a theory. It's not an exaggerated warning. While most people discuss this month's inflation and the interest rates of the next meeting, institutional capital has already silently shifted its position within the global financial system. And this is where almost everyone gets lost. This type of capital flow doesn't happen by opinion. It happens by structural necessity. If you have money in the bank, retirement savings, funds, or simply depend on the system to live, this is already impacting your financial life, even if it hasn't yet appeared on your statement. The detail that almost no one realizes is that large asset managers aren't driven by headlines, they're driven by systemic risk. The truth is simple and uncomfortable. While the average investor is distracted, wealthy families, global banks, and institutional investors are executing a strategic reallocation that redefines hegemony, reserve currency, and monetary confidence. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what stage of this cycle we're in, why this movement didn't start where everyone is looking, and what history shows usually comes next. Understanding this now is different from understanding it later. The crux of the matter is simple, but almost no one confronts it head on. Your money in the bank isn't really yours. Banks aren't vaults. They are highly leveraged cogs in the fiduciary system, dependent on something invisible called monetary confidence. The detail that almost no one notices is that when this confidence falters, the system doesn't slow down, it freezes. And this has happened before, always when everything seemed too solid. Few people know this, but banks operate with fractional reserves, keeping only a tiny fraction of the money they promise to return. The rest is borrowed, leveraged, and redistributed through the global capital flow. This seems small, but it's not. This is where everything starts to change, because this model only works as long as nobody asks for everything at once. History shows that this is always the overlooked mistake. When liquidity dwindles, emergency mechanisms kick in: swaps, special lines of credit, silent bailouts between global banks and financial institutions. The system seemed solid, but institutional capital was already moving before the panic set in. Smart money doesn't wait for headlines. It anticipates structural disruptions. This has happened before in different cycles following the same script. The real impact doesn't appear in the newspapers. It appears in daily limits, delays, temporary freezes, and subtle rule changes. It's not outright confiscation, it's operational erosion. Great managers understand that the risk isn't in the public debt, but in the financial infrastructure that sustains the system. The collapse didn't begin where everyone was looking. It began with liquidity. And here's the key point that connects everything. If the risk lies in the banking structure, then the right question isn't how much does the government owe, but how is capital being reallocated away from that risk? Because while the system demands confidence, the institutional investor demands survival. In the next point, you'll understand why this reallocation doesn't start with currency. It starts with energy. There's an uncomfortable truth that spans centuries. Money follows energy, not the other way around. Currencies only work as long as they can buy energy, transportation, and production. The detail that almost no one notices is that whenever control of energy changes hands, the monetary order follows soon after. And this has happened before, and almost no one saw it coming. Oil, gas, critical metals, and supply chains are not just commodities. They are the foundation of real economic power. When global banks and institutional investors observe changes in these flows, institutional capital begins to move silently. This is where everything starts to change, because currencies cannot survive without a functional energy backing, even in a fiat system. In recent years, bilateral agreements have begun to emerge outside the traditional logic of reserve currencies. Producing and consuming countries are redesigning the flow of energy capital, often bypassing the traditional financial system. Few realized it at the time, but this is always the initial stage of the loss of monetary hegemony. The mistake was ignoring the signs. The impact of this doesn't appear as an immediate collapse. It emerges as structural inflation, a persistently higher cost of living, and instability in basic prices. It seems like a common economic problem, but it isn't. It's an energy problem disguised as inflation. Great managers have understood this for decades. That's why diversification starts with real assets. And here's the connection to the next point. When energy becomes more expensive and scarce, it's not the financial system that suffers first. It's the population. And when the population ages at the same time, the risk ceases to be cyclical and becomes mathematical. In the next topic, you'll understand why demographics, not debt, is the real silent bomb of the system. The crux of the matter here is often overlooked because it's too slow to become headline news. The problem isn't money, it's people. Economic systems don't break down when debt grows. They break down when the productive base shrinks. The detail that almost no one notices is that demographics don't negotiate. They simply advance, year after year, silently. For decades, the global financial system was built on the assumption of continuous population growth. More workers, more consumption, more taxes, more support for pensions. This seems logical, but it is no longer true. Few realized it at the time, but the birth rate began to fall while commitments only increased. The mistake was ignoring the mathematical signs. Today, fewer workers are supporting more retirees, putting pressure on pension systems that were already fragile from the start. Governments try to plug the hole with debt, but institutional investors know that this doesn't solve the core of the problem. This is where everything starts to change, because no capital flow can compensate for an inverted population pyramid. The visible response has been higher taxes, persistent inflation, and more expensive and worse public services. The invisible response is the silent reallocation of institutional capital to regions, sectors, and assets less dependent on population growth. Wealthy families and large managers don't wait for reforms. They anticipate structural insolvency. And here's the hook that leads to the next stage. When the system realizes it can no longer uphold its promises, it needs to better control what still works. And it's precisely at this point that technology comes in, not as liberating innovation, but as an instrument of financial control. In the next section, you'll understand why the money of the future may not be as free as it seems. There's a tipping point that almost no one is seriously discussing. Financial technology isn't being built for freedom, but for control. The detail that almost no one notices is that whenever monetary confidence starts to falter, the system responds with more surveillance, not more autonomy. This has happened before, just with less sophisticated tools. Central bank digital currencies don't appear out of nowhere. They emerge when the fiat system needs to guarantee complete traceability of capital flows. Programmability, automatic limits, and rules embedded in money seem like technical details, but they are not. This is where everything starts to change, because money ceases to be neutral and becomes conditional. For the average citizen, this is sold as efficiency and security. For financial institutions, it's systemic survival. For institutional investors, it's a clear sign that structural risk has increased. Large fund managers know that when scrutiny increases, it's because the system no longer trusts the spontaneous behavior of economic agents. The real impact doesn't appear all at once. It emerges as a gradual loss of privacy, invisible restrictions, and total dependence on centralized financial infrastructure. It's not an isolated event. It's a logical response to decades of expansion, leverage, and promises impossible to sustain. The mistake was ignoring the earlier signs. And here's the inevitable hook. When control increases and trust decreases, countries and blocs begin to protect themselves. Chains shorten, alliances break down, and the world ceases to operate as a single system. In the next topic, you will understand why deglobalization is not a step backward. It is a defensive reaction to the collapse of the previous order. The point of tension now is silent but profound. The integrated world you know is ending, not because of ideology, but out of necessity. The detail that almost no one notices is that global systems only work when monetary confidence and predictability are stable. When that breaks down, fragmentation ceases to be an option and becomes a defense. For decades, the global financial system was optimized for maximum efficiency, not resilience. Long supply chains, concentrated production, and extreme interdependence worked as long as capital flows were predictable. Few realized it at the time, but a shock was all it took to expose its fragility. The mistake was ignoring the signs of excessive interdependence. Today, global banks, governments, and institutional investors talk about reshoring, nearshoring, and friendshoring. These names sound technical, but they mean the same thing: reducing systemic risk. This is where everything starts to change because efficiency gives way to control. Large asset managers understand that the new priority is systemic security, not accelerated growth. The direct impact is felt in everyday life: higher prices, fewer options, and persistent inflation. Fragmentation breaks the logic of low costs that sustain the middle class. For institutional capital, this is just a new phase in the cycle. For those who depend on wages, it's a continuous loss of purchasing power. The system seems solid, but it was simply stretched too far. And here's the hook that connects to the next point. When the world fragments and costs rise, someone has to foot the bill. And historically, it's not the asset holders. In the next topic, you'll understand why the collapse isn't widespread. It's selective, and it hits the middle class hard. The point of tension here is uncomfortable because it's personal. The system isn't breaking down for everyone, only for those who live on a salary. The detail that almost no one notices is that modern crises don't destroy wealth, they reallocate it. And this silent transfer happens far from the spotlight, within the global financial system itself. While wages grow slowly, financial and real assets advance at a different pace. This may seem like mere inflation, but it's not. It's a structural mechanism of the fiduciary system, where new money first enters the right hands. Institutional investors, wealthy families, and large asset managers benefit before the cost reaches the rest of the economy. The mistake was ignoring the signs of this asymmetry. The middle class is trapped in the middle: fixed income, rising taxes, and increasingly expensive credit. Institutional capital protects itself through diversification and privileged access to financial instruments. Meanwhile, those who depend on salaries face increasing debt to maintain the same standard of living. This seems small, but it's not. This is where everything starts to change. The most insidious aspect is that the system transforms effort into illusion. Working harder no longer means progress. It only means running to avoid falling behind. Few realized it at the time, but the financialization of the economy changed the rules of the game. The flow of capital does not reward productivity. It rewards strategic positioning within the system. And here's the final hook before the biggest risk. When a growing portion of the population loses purchasing power, instability ceases to be economic and becomes political and geopolitical. And it is precisely at this point that money becomes a weapon. In the next topic, you will understand why the invisible geopolitical risk is the most underestimated threat to the current monetary order. The final point of tension is the most ignored, precisely because it doesn't seem personal. The biggest wars today are not military, they are financial. The detail that almost no one notices is that the money you consider neutral can become a tool of political pressure. And when that happens, monetary confidence doesn't break all at once. It dissolves slowly. In recent years, the freezing of sovereign reserves has shown something that was previously only theoretical. Assets within the global financial system are only yours as long as you're aligned with the rules of the game. Few realized it at the time, but this event forever changed the perception of risk. Global banks, financial institutions, and institutional investors understood the message immediately. The response was silent but clear. Diversification of reserves, increased assets outside the traditional system, and reduced dependence on a single reserve currency. Institutional capital doesn't react out of ideology, it reacts out of survival. This is where everything begins to change, because financial hegemony only exists as long as no one fears arbitrary sanction. For the average citizen, this seems distant. But the impact is direct. Greater volatility, exchange rate instability, and less economic predictability. When countries lose confidence in the system, the flow of capital becomes even more fragmented. The collapse didn't begin where everyone was looking. It began with the use of money as a weapon. And here's the link that closes the cycle. When banks become fragile, energy becomes more expensive, populations age, technology takes over, supply chains fragment, and the middle class impoverishes, geopolitical risk ceases to be external. It enters the system. History shows that monetary orders don't collapse in wars. They collapse when trust ends. Economic history never breaks down suddenly. It warns. It always warns. The system seemed solid. The institution seemed unshakable, and confidence seemed eternal. And yet, this has happened before. Monetary orders don't collapse because of a single event, but because of the sum of fragilities that silently advance until the flow of capital changes direction. When global banks become dependent on emergency liquidity, when energy redefines alliances, when demographics make promises mathematically impossible, when technology begins to monitor instead of liberate, when the world fragments and the middle class loses ground, the pattern becomes clear. It is not a one-off crisis. It is a transition of hegemony within the global financial system. The real question isn't whether something will change. It's who will realize it first. Because understanding these cycles doesn't prevent transformation, but it completely changes your position within it. Institutional capital, institutional investors, and wealthy families don't panic. They move, and they move early, guided by structural risk, not headlines. You don't need to predict the collapse. You need to recognize the stage. You need to understand that monetary confidence is not a guaranteed right. It's a fragile agreement. And fragile agreements always require diversification, vigilance, and a cold reading of history. The mistake was never the crisis. The mistake was ignoring the signs. If this content resonated with you, it's because you're not here out of curiosity. You're here for protection. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and stay tuned. In the next video, we'll show how capital protects itself when trust in the system begins to falter, and why those who understand this early on are never caught off guard.